So this is the first time we're covering Jethro Tull. This is their fourth album, Aqualung. It comes in at number 86 on Best Ever Albums of the 70s. It's ranked number 15 in 1971, 327 of all time, and it does not make Rolling Stone's top 500 list. And I like Josh's background. I have to give props to it. He's got the Will Ferrell Anchorman flute, fire coming out of the flute.
Playing the Yaz flute.
Yaz flute, yep.
Would you like to play some Yaz flute? So this album sold very well. It is by far Jethro Tull's best-selling album. It peaked at number 4 in the UK and number 7 in the US. And so a little bit about the background of the band. They formed in Blackpool, England in 1967 by Ian Anderson, Jeffrey Hammond, and John Evan. They were all schoolmates, and Anderson taught himself to play Spanish guitar. Evan was a piano player, but then he took up the drums, and they also recruited their friend Hammond to play bass. But shortly after, really in the early years, the lineup changes multiple times, and Hammond and Evan actually leave the band. They're really not there in the they're in their very beginning, but then they kind of leave and do their own thing. So the band changes members, and as much as they change their name, because as they go into these different clubs, they're actually starting off playing Blue Eyed Soul, believe it or not, is how they started playing, and if they would usually not get a whole lot of attention. So in order to play the similar venues again, they would change their names so that the owners of the clubs would think that there's somebody different, and they'd show up to try to play again so they could continue to get gigs. But they settled on the name Jethro Tull. Their names were actually being provided by the booking agent staff, and one of these staff members was a history buff, and he offered up a name Jethro Tull after the 18th century agriculturist. And they had that name one night at a club. The manager liked them, decided to book them again, and they said, all right, we're sticking with Jethro Tull. So Anderson is most known, as Josh has in his background, as being a rock and roll flute player. And the reason he came
flautist,
correct?
Yes, flautist.
Yes, thank you, John. That's correct.
Not to be confused with a pianist.
Not the pianist, the flautist. And he became a flautist because, well, he initially wanted to be a guitarist, but and he was, his idol was Eric Clapton, a lot of the blues guitarists, and he realized quickly he was not going to be anywhere near as good as they were. He was a very average guitar player, and he decided, well, let me do something else that will stand out, that will be a little bit different, and he goes with the flute. Wow. And it becomes a distinctive part of this band that's. He later said, "I was surprised more people didn't do this. That didn't bring the flute into rock and roll." But it's one of the signature sounds of Jethro Tull. Mm-hmm. So their first big break comes at a performance at the National Blues Festival in August of '68. They received a very big reception, and that starts to get them record deals. Their first album's released in 1968, reaches number 10 on the charts. Starting to describe themselves as a progressive blues band with a little bit of jazz. And here's some good stats. I think we might have talked about some of this stuff earlier, but after the release of their album, their guitarist quits the band due to conflicts with Ian Anderson, and they're searching for a new guitarist, and one of the people that they search out is Mick Taylor, who would later become part of the Rolling Stones. But Taylor decides... Yeah, go ahead.
We also mentioned somebody, I think you're going to get there, though, because there's someone else we mentioned, who I remember, believe it or not, but I'll let you do it. Yep.
Does Josh remember?
Nope.
Josh doesn't remember. Okay. Josh you probably know, but
wasn't it Tony Iommi from Black Sabbath? Yeah.
Yep.
Okay. Yep. For like a week, right? Josh said he was in the band?
Oh,
yes.
You're right.
Yes.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Uh-huh.
So first they go to Mick Taylor. Mick Taylor says, "Nah, thanks, Heath. I think I have a better gig with my current band."
Correct.
Does anybody? No, it wasn't the Rolling Stones.
The Pretty Things.
Nope.
No.
The band that he was out on at the time. Oh, if you get this, John, you go ahead.
So I remember, like, Mick and Dick Taylor were both in the same band, like a band I did way back when. God, I don't know if I know.
This is a band I've never heard of. It's called John Mayall's Blues Breakers.
Oh,
yes.
Okay, I know them.
Mm-hmm. Me too, actually.
So this is the band that Mick Taylor was in at the time, and he felt that was a better gig than Jethro Tull. And then they go to Tom.
Incorrect. Yes. Rolling Stones, correct. That John Mayall's Breaker Blues band, no, not a better band.
Well,
continue. Yeah.
But so then they do approach Tommy Iommi, whose band was actually
Tony Iommi.
Yep. Tony.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
And so he does join Jethro Tull. He quits Earth, who would later become known as Black Sabbath, and he does perform them for a very short period of time, but then he goes back to them. So they finally settle on a guitarist named Martin Barr, who is the person playing on this record. So the band starts playing tours. They're opening for Hendrix and Zeppelin, and Anderson really, kind of establishes himself as the main songwriter at this time. They headline a tour in the U.S. for the first time. They are asked to play Woodstock, but they turn it down because Anderson feels that that would mean that they would become pigeonholed into a certain sound and the hippie movement, and he didn't want any part of that. So he's like, no, thank you.
Boy, that could have been bad decision genes there, huh? But it ended up working out. Yeah.
And so then they do their third album. And this is after the third album is released. Anderson's going back to the original two members, Evan and Hammond, asking them to be part of the band, and then they come back into play on Aqualung. So reading the different lineup changes was kind of like reading about the first chapter in the Bible where they talk about all the fathers that begat this guy, begat that. I'm like, there's way too many people here. So, and I think the band over the course of their history has had over 30 members in it or something. It
seems
like
a lot of these prog rock bands cycle through members pretty.
Yeah, but Ian Anderson is Jethro Tull, essentially, is what you're getting there.
Yep.
Fun fact, they record this at a new studio, Island Records in London, and there's two studios there, and they recorded this in one studio, in the larger studio, and the band recording in the smaller studio was Led Zeppelin, recording Led Zeppelin 4. So they did cross paths with Zeppelin during that. Ian Anderson does say that the production, even though it was a new studio, it was almost like a former church kind of building that they were in, and as you can tell with this record, the production's not that great, and he never felt that it really sounded the way that he wanted to because of limited production capabilities. A couple more things. So on this, you have Ian Anderson with lead vocals, acoustic guitar, and flute. Martin Barr's electric guitars. Jeffrey Hammond is playing the bass. John Evans on piano, organ, and mellotron. And Clive Bunker is on drums and percussion. So many people thought this was a concept album. This is regarded as a concept album, but that is a claim that Ian Anderson has roundly refuted for many, many years. He said, okay, there's a couple of songs that have similar themes, but he's like, that does not make this a concept album. And he was very adamant that this is not the case. It sold over 7 million copies, and it catapulted them to stardom. It had 2 singles, including Hymn 43 and Locomotive Breath, and it did receive some mixed reviews. A couple of them in Rolling Stone magazine, Ben Gerson lauded its fine musicianship, calling it serious and intelligent, although he felt that the album's seriousness undermined its quality. Robert Christgau, we've talked about him several times, yes. Said that he was more critical of the album in a 1981 review, and he described Anderson's undeveloped cultural interests and negative views on religion and human behavior as both boring and pretentious. And speaking of Iron Maiden, somebody that really loved this album was Iron Maiden's Steve Harris, who plays bass from Iron Maiden. And he called Aqualung a classic album, lauding its fantastic playing, fantastic songs, attitude, and vibe. Iron Maiden would actually go on to cover Cross-Eyed Mary, one of the songs on this album, as the B-side of their 1983 single, The Trooper. So another fun fact there. So there you go. Aqualung, Jethro Tull.
Not in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, Matt?
Not that I know of. We're going to cover them again, so I didn't go further than that. So
gotcha.
We're going to cover the next album. So,
nice.
So let's start off with what am I? I want to hear. Let's hear Josh. I want to hear your thoughts on this first, Josh.
Guys, I like this album. It was pretty awesome. I was really surprised. I did not know anything about Jethro Tull, and the more I listened to this album, the more I got on its wavelength. If this is classified as progressive rock or prog rock, this is by far my favorite prog rock album that we've listened to. And here's why. I thought long and hard about this. It's because they are grounded in guitars and like hard playing guitar too, and that really spoke to me. They sound like Black Sabbath a lot of the times in my mind in terms of some of the guitar licks, and they also incorporate they almost sound like a rock opera type of album, or like Meatloaf or something like that, and I really appreciated that. And then they layer in this other they've got the flute, right? Obviously, that's a key to it. But the flute is used in really interesting ways, and I don't find it annoying. It's used like they'll have a flute solo, and then they'll like drop into like some crazy like guitar lick or like guitar movement, or they have they incorporate it in terms of, I feel like they put a lot of like British folk into this album, or in the same way that like Fairport Convention or maybe even a little bit of Led Zeppelin, they put that and then they use the flute in that, and then they go back to the guitar. Or they have like the really like good bass like line that keeps the tempo throughout the whole song. And so yeah, that I really was able to get into this album as a result. When you contrast it to other prog rock bands we listen to, like Moody Blues or King Crimson, those ones are really almost grounded in like classical music or synth or like Moog or electronic music of some sort, right? And they don't have always the tempo, or they kind of break their songs up into different movements or, you know, pieces. And I feel like this was more coherent to me, and I was able to follow along, and they were just... And I appreciated the flute-like craziness that they would drop in too.
I was wondering what you would think about that, because I'm like, I wonder if this is a little out there.
Yeah,
you know, I don't know how Josh would like that.
I feel like it was a good like stretch in a new direction without going like too far out there for me. Other things that the album kind of reminded me of, I heard like some Peter Gabriel type of stuff in this, like Mother Goose reminded me of that. I think because of the way. He obviously was in Genesis, but I'm thinking more specifically of his solo stuff. I think something about the tempo of some of the songs or the way they change the time signature, maybe that like rung a bell for me. And yeah, it just worked for me. I liked it. I wasn't too into it the first time I listened to it, but by the time I listened to it the second time through, I liked it more. So I dug this album. I think it's interesting. I got a lot of religious references. I tried to listen to the lyrics too on a listen through, and I mean, I can understand him saying it's not a concept album, but there is definitely some concept going through his head when writing these lyrics or whatever, or gods and I mean, some of the songs are called My God and Hymn 43, and I feel like there's definitely something that's going on in his head that he wanted to get out in that.
I mean, it's very clearly an anti-religion album.
Yeah.
I mean, every song is sort of like about how religion breaks or judges man in some way or another. And you know the fallacy of mortals, and stuff like that. I don't know how you can say this isn't a concept album, at least lyrically. It's pretty clearly. I mean, I don't know. Ian Anderson's an eccentric dude from everything I've seen. If you ever see him perform, he's an interesting guy to watch perform.
He does this like tree pose, yoga pose when he plays the flute. It's like this weird balancing, and he's kicking one leg while the other one's it's really
it's the thing that Ron Burgundy does in Anchorman.
Yeah,
you know what I mean when he plays. Okay. Yeah. Nice. So, oh gosh, guys, where do I start on Jethro Tull? Like, Jethro Tull is the weirdest band for me because they're like the girl with the curl. That's it. When they're good, they're really good, and when they're bad, they're really like. Let's start with the good. Like, this is a great guitar album. Like, Josh is right. There's even like kind of like Black Sabbath-y type guitar licks in this. There's really good electric guitar in this album. And those are the parts where you're like, I'm down with Jethro Tull. Jethro Tull's also an incredibly good transition band. Like, they write long songs that you can stay with because they transition excellently in songs. And I'm not as familiar with like later 70s Jethro Tull, and I'm hoping that's maybe where we get an album from so I can get a taste of that. I mean, I know this album pretty well, especially like, Aqualung and My God. I feel like those songs you can't help but run into from somewhere, the two long songs on this album. So, I mean, as a transition band, everybody can play their instruments, and, it's a really good guitar album. The lyrics, while a little bit, over the top, even work for me on this album. So it's interesting themes, and unlike a lot of stuff that kind of goes into, Middle Earth and, you know, Middle Ages and stuff, like I can stay with it more than I normally can. And Josh is right. This harkens to some of the British folk music that we talked about in Fairport Convention. I think we do Richard and Linda Thompson pretty soon too, right? So I'll be interested to see if that continues. Now, stuff I don't like about Jethro Tull. The flute I just can't do. I hate it. It's as disturbing for me on it as the Electric Jug was on that 13th Floor Elevators album.
Oh,
I never want to hear it ever. Like whenever it comes, I'm like, ugh. It's just I don't want it there. It like, you know, I'm surprised no one else did this in rock. You said Ian Anderson said, like, I'm not, and that's why, because I'm sure a lot of people heard it the same way I did. Yeah. It is a calling card, I get it, but it does not. It doesn't do anything for me. If anything, it just gets in the way at times. So let me start with that. The other thing with Jethro Tull albums a lot of times is I don't get a flow in a Jethro Tull album like I do in other albums. Now, with that being said, it doesn't get in the way of my enjoyment of the album, and I'm still going to say that this album is a recommend for me, but it just never seems like it goes over the bar of like when you're in a run of songs, you know? It's like right when it starts to get there, they go in a direction, whether it be like having a short song that just doesn't seem like it fits, or the flute, or, you know, like that, you know, like folk sound I hate, you know, and like, so it just can't ever get away from the stuff that knocks it off the rails. And if they just had dialed down some of that stuff, but if they dial it down, guys, they're not Jethro Tull. And as a result, I mean, Jethro Tull is pretty famously despised by critics, and I always thought they got a bad rap because their stuff is, although this album I think was received well, but like I always think of them like, you know, 70s and 80s, you know, they kind of become like almost like a caricature for some critics. But I always thought that was really underplaying them because they're talented musicians. But yeah, Josh did a really good job of analyzing the parts of it that are here. I'm pretty sure I know how Matt feels about this album, but Matt, you've been patient. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I've had this album for many years. I think my brother brought it home from college or something like that, and I was like, "What is this?" Like from the album cover, like, you know, the homeless guy all like disheveled. I was like, "Jeff, what is?" And from the first track, I was like, "Holy crap, this is awesome! What a great opening track!" Like that is, and I see what you're saying there, John, and you know, Aqualung is kind of like a prog rock song because there's different segments, but they do flow well together. And
they
this
sure
is
do.
Like,
yep.
And this is I'm going to be. This is one of the reasons I'm excited about covering Genesis, because I feel like that one, you know, that's a band I feel like that does that very well as it too. So this is kind of like, it's considered a prog rock album, and but Josh is right, it's very different than like the Yes and the King Crimson and you know, stuff like that, Moody Blues. Actually, when Ian Anderson was talking about playing the flute, he was saying, he's like, I get credited for, you know, starting the flute and rock and roll or doing this thing, but the Moody Blues were doing it before I was. And I was like, yeah, but they were doing
it, but like, not nearly like it was an accompaniment in a small piece, which works. Yeah.
Which is actually, John, I'm kind of interested because you're talking about how much you love like the guitar, you know, the songs, and the flute is in those heavier songs. It's not like they reserve the flute for the, you know, for just those slow acoustic songs. It's very prominent in the harder songs. And so you must have a love-hate relationship with
I do.
Yeah.
That's how I feel about that's why it's so weird. Like they can write a song like Aqualung that throughout has these great transitions, but then the album doesn't have. You'd think they'd seamlessly weave between songs, but therein is the enigma that is, you know, Jethro Tull. They can write a song that's long with all these great transitions, but then the transition between tracks doesn't connect for me. Yeah. So that's why Jethro Tull's such an odd band for me.
Yeah. But you're right. I do love this record. I think the guitar, totally in line with what you're saying about the guitar rock in this. I don't mind the flute at all. I really like it. It's in a weird way. It does, like Josh says, it seems like it shouldn't fit, but I think to me it does. Even the parts where he does the full-blown flute solo and he's getting so into it that he's like, ugh! Like
I heard that too.
You know, he's doing like the cool, you know, like guttural sounds that
you can hear him like inhaling and thrusting out the the noise.
He's playing that. He's going, and he always talked about how hard it was. He's like, the flute doesn't really amplify very well. You kind of have to really play it, you know. So that's the other interesting thing. You wouldn't think that it fits, but it kind of does.
Can I give a guitar sound? But this album, the guitar on this at times sounds like big stadium rock guitar, like Bad Company type guitar, you know, and it's before that. So like that's kind of the sound of the guitar here, that real big like stadium mid 70s to late 70s, you know, almost like Boston-y like guitar.
Like Wind Up is a good example of that.
Yes.
Which is a great song as well, which is another one that's like, that doesn't have a religious, I mean, Wind Up isn't religious in and of itself, but then you listen to lyrics and it's all about that stuff, you know? So I see what you're saying about the flow, but I'm okay with it because I do like those acoustic songs. They're very short. They do break it up in a little bit of a different way, but I think that they're very good. I still think that they're really good, you know, acoustic songs, very interesting. He was being influenced by a couple of folk artists that he was really trying to emulate, guys I never heard of, and I didn't write it down actually, so maybe I can clean that stack next week. But so he was trying to kind of emulate some of those folk artists that he really was kind of getting into. But I think that they're very good. You know, and Mother Goose, I'm kind of interested that Josh likes that song, because that was something I heard that I'm like, man, this sounds like a Renaissance Festival thing. I don't think Josh would.
I hated that song.
Yeah, that one sounds the most British folky, like Fairport Convention kind of like, you know, let's play the lute and like let's have like, you know, I don't know, pixies and stuff dancing around.
Flanks of meat.
Yeah,
I didn't necessarily like that song, but it did not go too far into that for me. But the cool thing about that, but the cool thing about that, because it starts off very much like that, whatever that, and that's not just flutes, that's other stuff going on there. It sounds like, you know, but towards the end they get the distorted guitar in there. It starts to rock out a little bit, so it kind of reels it in, even when they go kind of out in that realm a little bit. But no, the great guitar riffs on here. This was an album that did not take me long at all to get into. I think I was just surprised that I didn't really know anything about them, and how much, like, Aqualung is just a classic rock song. That guitar solo is fantastic. The acoustic part, like the softer acoustic part that leads into the guitar solo, is just really pretty. It's a great chord progression. My only complaint about this album does lie within the production, because there are parts. Wind Up is a great example of that. It starts off so like the music's way in the background, and it's almost like I need to turn it way up to hear it. And then they kick in with like the main part of the song, which is much louder than the intro. So then you blow your eardrums out. You're like, whoa, I got to turn it down. So it does play a little like that at various parts. And so I can totally tell what Anderson says when he talks about how difficult it was to record to get the right sounds. And even when it came out, it wasn't really what he wanted it to be or what he wanted it to sound like. But other than that, I think it's just a great album. You know, for 1971. I mean, it's its own thing, you know, and when he's playing that flute, it really does put that stamp on it. But there's other elements on here too that make it kind of unique for Jethro Tull beside the flute. And big thumbs up for me. This is right up my alley. You know, I don't have anything else to complain about other than that little production issue. So did their later albums maintain this kind of structure with the guitars and the flute, or did they kind of branch out and experiment more as well?
The flute's kind of is his thing, right? So I don't, honestly, this is the only Jethro Tull album that I know.
Oh, okay.
And so we're going to cover the next album, Thick as a Brick, which is their highest ranked album on Best Ever Albums. We're going to do that the next time around. I'm aware of that album, but they got so much more stuff out there, and I just never really listened to it. But this is the number one. I think they've sold like a total of 13 million albums, and they've sold 7 of those came from Aqualung.
Okay.
You know? They have a passionate fan base too. Yeah. That always, you know, I would say cult, but it's bigger than a cult fan base. You know, it's a
dedicated.
Steady. Yep. And another thing about this that's really interesting is normally I've been vocal, maybe not quite as much as Josh, but pretty vocal about, you know, long songs have their place, but too many. But 3 of my 4 favorite songs on this album would definitely be categorized as the over 6-minute variety. Yeah. The 3 6-minute songs are 3 of my favorite 4 songs. So, you know, Aqualung, My God, and Wind Up are 3 of my favorite 4, along with Locomotive Breath is my 4th. And they're all excellent songs. Yeah. And that's ultimately why this gets a thumbs up for me, because while there's the flute around and songs like Mother Goose that really doesn't do much for me. Him 43 is hit and miss for me. I know a lot of people. I think that's the single on this album, right? As crazy
It's one
as
of the
that
two.
sounds.
That and Locomotive Breath were singles.
Oh, I thought the other one was Aqualung. Okay, well, it makes sense because back then they weren't releasing long songs. As
Yeah,
singles.
Aqualung was too long, and it was too. It was the progressive nature of it was not very radio friendly.
I always have to remember that. Yeah, if you had something over 4 minutes, even if it was Hey Jude, right, you weren't getting on the radio.
Yeah.
So so
Nice.
interesting.
Yep. So we'll cover them again. At least I think just one more time. I don't think we have any. I don't think they're in the Rolling Stone list at all, to be honest. So we'll wrap that up at the next episode. But big thumbs up for me. Very very fun, rockin' album. This album rocks.
I would say a confident thumbs up for me. I wouldn't say it's in the top echelon of albums that we've done, but certainly it's an easy listen, and it's not overwhelmingly long either. So it's it gets in and out in a way that will not overdo it.
John, were you okay with the acoustic songs? I mean, did you? I know they're short. I know you don't really like the placement, but as far as musically, were they interesting at all to you, or that just filler?
It felt like filler to me.
Yeah.
I can't say they were bad, but they. I also, you got to understand, I have a well-established bias against Ren music sounding stuff, and while not all of them sounded like that, let me start by saying that. I don't know. You know what I mean? They didn't hit me as much. I think Jethro Tull is kind of at their best when they're doing a longer song, usually because they have to build in some of the guitar to that, which I love. And then they're an excellent transition band. They write really well structured long songs, even within a genre in prog rock that's what you. And Jethro Tull to me is not full on prog rock. They're kind of prog rock. Adjacent? There we go. That's what I was going for. Yeah, that little bit. But cousins with prog rock.
Yeah.
But they have that same characteristic that their bread and butter is the long songs.
Mm-hmm.
Yep.
Yeah, thumbs up for me as well. This would it would not be in my top 10 yet, but it is a category of nice surprises or bands I hadn't heard of that I liked. So.
Yeah, I feel like the 70s is doing pretty well with all of us. There's very few albums that all of us are not liking. So best ever albums. Thumbs up to you guys so far. You've really been nailing it. So